There is a country in Western Europe that has spent more than 3 decades passing law after law, court ruling after court ruling, government report after government report, all built around a single, deceptively small question: what a woman is allowed to wear on her own head. That country is France, and the fight is not a footnote in French politics. It is one of the most consistent, most explosive, most misunderstood political battles the country has fought since the Second World War, and almost nobody outside France actually understands why it keeps happening, why it never gets resolved, and why French politicians of nearly every stripe keep returning to it, year after year, decade after decade, as if the entire republic's identity depends on the outcome. It does, and to understand why, you have to go back further than most coverage of this topic ever bothers to go, back to a principle the French take more seriously than almost any other democracy on earth: laïcité. Laïcité is usually translated into English as secularism, and that translation is not wrong, but it badly undersells what the word actually means inside France. Anglo-American secularism, the kind most people in Britain, Canada, or the United States grew up with, is essentially a live and let live arrangement. The state stays neutral, and in exchange, individuals are broadly free to display their religion however they like, in public, on their clothing, around their neck, on their head, wherever. French laïcité, codified into law in 1905 after a century of brutal conflict between the Catholic Church and the French Republic, is a fundamentally different animal. It does not simply ask the state to stay neutral. It asks religion itself to retreat almost entirely from public life, to become something private, something practiced at home or in a place of worship, and to stay out of schools, out of government buildings, out of the visible fabric of shared civic space. The 1905 law was originally written with one religion overwhelmingly in mind: the Catholic Church, which had spent centuries entangled with the French state before the Revolution tried to tear that relationship apart. For most of the 20th century, laïcité was a settled, almost boring constitutional principle, rarely tested because France was, religiously speaking, overwhelmingly homogeneous. That changed decisively and permanently in 1989. That year, in a public school in the town of Creil, north of Paris, 3 teenage girls arrived at school wearing the hijab, the Islamic headscarf, and refused to remove it during class. The school suspended them. The incident, which became known nationally as l'affaire du foulard, the headscarf affair, exploded into a full-blown national debate almost overnight, because it forced France to confront something its founding secular principle had never really had to deal with before: a growing religious minority whose most visible marker of faith was not a small pendant you could tuck under a shirt, but a garment worn openly, deliberately, every single day, in the one place French law had always insisted should be religion-free. The debate that followed in 1989 did not resolve cleanly, and for 15 years France lived with an uneasy, inconsistent patchwork of school policies, some administrators tolerating headscarves, others banning them, court cases going in different directions depending on the region and the judge. That inconsistency finally ended in 2004, when the French Parliament passed a law banning what it called conspicuous religious symbols, ostentatious signs of religious affiliation, in all public primary and secondary schools. The law was written deliberately to appear religiously neutral. It technically banned large crosses, kippahs, and turbans just as much as headscarves. But nobody in France, then or now, seriously pretends the law was written with Sikh turbans or Jewish kippahs primarily in mind. It was written because of the hijab, and everyone involved in drafting it knew that. Fadela Amara, a French government minister at the time who was herself a Muslim woman, put the government's underlying position bluntly. The veil, she said, is the visible symbol of the subjugation of women, and has no place in the mixed, secular spaces of France's state schools. That single sentence, from a Muslim woman serving inside the French government, tells you something the international coverage of this topic routinely leaves out, something worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. This fight was never simply French secularists against French Muslims, a clean majority versus minority story that fits neatly into a headline. It has, from the very beginning, split opinion within French Muslim communities themselves, between those who see the veil as an expression of personal faith the state has no business regulating, and those who see it as a symbol of patriarchal control that a genuinely progressive, women-respecting republic has every right, maybe even every obligation, to push back against. 6 years after the school ban, France went further than any other country in Europe had dared to go. In 2010, the French Parliament passed a law banning face coverings, specifically the niqab and the full burqa, in all public spaces nationwide, not just schools. This is worth being precise about because it gets confused constantly in casual conversation. The 2010 law does not ban the hijab, the standard headscarf that covers the hair but leaves the face visible. It bans coverings that conceal the face entirely, on the grounds, according to the French government, that a liberal democracy fundamentally depends on citizens being able to see and be seen, to participate in a shared public life face to face, and that a garment specifically designed to remove a woman's face from public visibility is incompatible with that basic democratic architecture. In April 2011, France became the first country in Europe to actually enforce a nationwide ban like this, and, predictably, it was challenged all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. In 2014, in a case known as S.A.S versus France, the European Court upheld the ban, ruling that France was within its rights to prioritize what the court called the notion of living together, the idea that open, visible faces are a legitimate precondition for the kind of shared civic life a democracy depends on. That ruling matters enormously, because it means the hardest version of France's veil laws is not some rogue national eccentricity operating outside international human rights law. It has been explicitly tested against the highest human rights court in Europe, and it survived. The years that followed only expanded the battlefield. In 2016, a wave of French mayors, mostly along the Mediterranean coast, attempted to ban the burkini, a modest, full-body swimsuit worn by some Muslim women at public beaches, citing public order and secularism. The mayor of Cannes was among the first, issuing a municipal decree that some are banning beachwear that overtly manifests adherence to a religion at a time when France, still reeling from the Nice truck attack just weeks earlier, was operating under a nationwide state of emergency. Photographs of police officers standing over a woman on a Nice beach as she removed layers of clothing under the terms of a local burkini ban circulated globally and briefly turned a French municipal beachwear dispute into international news. French courts eventually struck most of those municipal beach bans down as overreach, but the underlying instinct behind them did not go away. It simply relocated. Burkinis remain banned today in public swimming pools across France, and when the city of Grenoble tried to lift its own pool ban in 2022, French courts blocked that attempt too, upholding the restriction. And you cannot understand why this debate kept intensifying through the 2010s without acknowledging the security backdrop it was unfolding against. Between 2015 and 2016, France endured a horrifying sequence of terrorist attacks. The Charlie Hebdo shooting, the coordinated Bataclan and Paris attacks that killed 130 people in a single night, the truck attack in Nice on Bastille Day. President François Hollande declared a state of emergency and asked Parliament to extend it repeatedly. Every single one of those attacks was carried out in the name of a violent, extremist interpretation of Islam, and every single one of them hardened French public opinion around exactly the question this video is about. How much visible, organized religious identity, specifically Islamic religious identity, is compatible with a secular republic that had just watched over 100 of its citizens murdered by people acting, however perversely, under an Islamic banner. That context does not, on its own, justify every subsequent law. But it explains, honestly and without exaggeration, why French political appetite for tolerating ambiguity around Islamic religious symbolism collapsed so decisively during exactly this period, and why the laws that followed were not simply abstract philosophical debates about secularism, but were unfolding inside a country that had just been through a genuine, sustained campaign of Islamist terrorism. By 2023, the fight had moved into a new and, in some ways, even more contentious space. The abaya, a long, loose-fitting robe worn by some Muslim women and girls, distinct from the hijab because it does not cover the hair at all, only the body. The French government banned abayas, along with the male equivalent, the thobe, in state schools, arguing that the garment functioned as a religious symbol in all but name, an attempt, in the government's framing, to root around the 2004 headscarf ban using a different piece of clothing that technically left the head uncovered. Here is where critics of these laws make an argument worth actually engaging with honestly, rather than dismissing. The law, as legal scholars have pointed out, does not and cannot legally define exactly what an abaya is, because French secularism law is constitutionally barred from producing an official definition of any religious garment. That ambiguity was handed directly to individual school head teachers, who were left to decide, on their own judgment, on a garment-by-garment basis, whether a given student's loose dress counted as a banned religious statement or simply a modest fashion choice, with essentially no formal government guidance on where that line actually sits. That is a genuine, legitimate criticism of how the law functions in practice, regardless of what you think about the underlying secular principle behind it. And then came the fight that pulled this entire domestic French debate onto a global stage: sport. Ahead of the Paris 2024 Olympics, the French government confirmed that French athletes competing for their own country, on their own home soil, in their own Olympic Games, would be barred from wearing the hijab, even though the International Olympic Committee itself places no such restriction on any other national delegation. France stood alone among every competing nation in imposing that restriction on its own team. Several individual sports federations in France, including football, basketball, and rugby, had already independently banned the hijab in competition years earlier, and by the 2024 to 2025 season, competitive volleyball joined that list too. Then, in 2025, French senators went further still, passing a broader bill intended to convert this patchwork of individual federation bans into a single, unified, nationwide law covering every sports federation in the country at every level of competition, from professional leagues down to amateur weekend leagues. The bill's own sponsor in the Senate, Michel Savin, did not describe the hijab in gentle, procedural language. He called it a Trojan horse for political Islam, and demanded, in his own words, a swift vote to end all ambiguity. France's interior minister at the time, Bruno Retailleau, went even further at a public rally explicitly organized against what French officials call Islamism, declaring, and this is a direct quote reported by multiple outlets, "Long live sports and down with the veil." Retailleau also used a specific, deliberately loaded term to describe what he believes is happening when observant Muslim women choose to wear the hijab while competing in French sport: entryism, a word borrowed from old Trotskyist political theory, describing a tactic of quietly infiltrating a mainstream institution in order to slowly advance a separate ideological agenda from the inside. According to Retailleau and several of his government colleagues, a woman wearing a headscarf on a French volleyball court is not simply expressing personal faith. She is, in their explicit political framing, a foothold for the broader political project of Islamism inside one of French civic life's most visible, most unifying institutions: sport itself. That is an aggressive, deliberately confrontational way to frame a piece of fabric, and it deserves to be stated plainly because softening it would misrepresent exactly what French officials themselves are actually arguing, and because pretending this is only a dispute about clothing choices would flatten a debate that is really about how a modern secular republic decides who gets to belong inside its shared civic identity. It is also worth being honest about the other side of this fight, because pretending it does not exist would make this video propaganda rather than analysis. A French government-commissioned report into radicalization in sport, the very same report cited by ministers pushing this legislation, concluded there is no structural or even significant pattern of radicalization or communitarian separatism happening inside French sporting federations. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have both formally condemned the sports hijab bill as discriminatory, arguing it will functionally exclude thousands of observant Muslim women and girls from organized sport entirely, not because they pose any demonstrated security or radicalization risk, but simply because of what they choose to wear on their heads. The United Nations Human Rights Committee has already ruled, in a separate case concerning France's earlier bans, that the restrictions violate the right to manifest one's religious beliefs. A group of veiled French athletes, calling themselves Les Hijabeuses, has taken their fight all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, and unlike the 2014 case that upheld the face covering ban, this new complaint was formally ruled admissible in March, meaning the court has agreed to actually hear the case on its merits, with a ruling expected sometime in 2026. If that ruling goes against France, it could force the French government to revisit the entire national sports ban from the ground up. One member of the French national basketball scene, Salimata Silla, was expelled mid-match 2 years ago for wearing a headscarf and has become one of the public faces of the resistance to these laws, arguing publicly that sport is supposed to be a tool for empowerment, not a gatekeeping mechanism for who gets to belong. To understand how deeply this issue sits inside mainstream French politics, and not just its far-right fringe, it helps to look at who has actually driven these laws forward. It was not exclusively politicians associated with Marine Le Pen's National Rally, the party most foreign observers assume must be behind every French debate involving Islam. President Emmanuel Macron himself, a centrist by nearly any reasonable definition, delivered a major national address in October 2020 explicitly targeting what he called Islamist separatism, describing it as a conscious project to build a counter-society within France, with its own schools, its own sports clubs, its own community rules, deliberately organized to pull citizens away from the shared institutions of the French Republic. Macron's government followed that speech with a formal law against separatism, passed in 2021, which included new restrictions on homeschooling specifically designed to prevent parents from removing children from the secular curriculum of state schools, tighter state oversight of foreign funding for religious organizations, and reinforced neutrality requirements for anyone delivering a public service. During the parliamentary debate over that same bill, the Senate, controlled by the traditional conservative right rather than Le Pen's party, passed its own amendment attempting to ban the hijab for girls under 18 in all public spaces nationwide, an amendment that ultimately did not survive into the final law after pushback in the National Assembly, but which revealed just how far mainstream conservative politicians, operating well outside the far right, were willing to go. The point here is not that every French politician agrees on every detail of every proposed restriction. Plenty of loud, public disagreement exists even within the traditional right and centre. The point is that the underlying premise, that visible Islamic religious practice represents a coordinated political challenge to French secularism, requiring an active legislative response, is not a fringe position confined to one extremist party. It runs through the mainstream governing centre of French politics under presidents who campaigned explicitly as moderates. France is also not acting in total isolation, even if its version of these laws goes further than almost anywhere else. Belgium passed its own national ban on full face coverings in public in 2011, just months after France, citing nearly identical security and social integration arguments. Austria followed with its own face veil ban in 2017. Outside Europe entirely, the Canadian province of Quebec, which has its own long, complicated history of asserting a distinct secular identity within a broader, officially multicultural country, passed Bill 21 in 2019, barring public sector workers in positions of authority, including teachers, police officers, and judges, from wearing any visible religious symbol at all while on duty, a law that functions almost identically in spirit to France's 2004 school ban, just applied to public employees generally rather than students specifically. And in an irony that rarely makes it into Western coverage of this topic, France's approach actually has more in common historically with a Muslim majority country than with most of its European neighbours. Modern Turkey, founded by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk on an explicitly secular constitutional model, spent most of the 20th century restricting religious dress in public institutions just as aggressively as France does today, banning headscarves for civil servants, judges, and university students for decades, before a series of reforms under more recent governments gradually relaxed those restrictions. France's laïcité, in other words, is not some uniquely Western, uniquely Islamophobic invention dreamed up in reaction to a growing Muslim population. It sits inside a broader, older, genuinely cross-cultural tradition of secular nation-states, including a Muslim majority one, concluding independently that visible religious symbolism inside state institutions poses a real enough risk to civic unity to justify direct legal restriction. None of this happens in a demographic vacuum either, and it is worth stating the numbers plainly rather than dancing around them, because the scale of what is actually being debated matters. France has, by a wide margin, the largest Muslim population of any country in Western Europe, a legacy shaped heavily by its colonial history in North Africa, particularly Algeria, and the large-scale labour migration that followed Algerian independence in 1962, along with subsequent waves of migration from Morocco, Tunisia, and other former French territories across multiple generations. Estimates of France's Muslim population generally run somewhere between 5 and 6 million people, roughly 8 to 9% of the total national population, concentrated heavily in and around major cities including Paris, Marseille, and Lyon. That is not a marginal statistical footnote. It is a population large enough that decisions about what its women and girls are permitted to wear in school, in the swimming pool, on the volleyball court, are not abstract philosophical exercises debated by academics in a seminar room. They are policies that directly touch millions of French citizens' daily lives, their access to education, their access to competitive sport, their basic freedom of movement through public space, which is exactly why the fight keeps returning to French politics with such intensity every single election cycle, and exactly why critics of these laws argue the sheer scale of the population affected makes the stakes of getting this wrong, in either direction, that much higher. Public opinion inside France itself, it is worth noting, does not split neatly along the lines outsiders often assume. Polling conducted over the past decade has repeatedly shown that a clear majority of the French public, cutting across a wide range of political affiliations, supports maintaining or even further tightening restrictions on visible Islamic religious symbols in schools and public institutions, while polling within France's own Muslim population shows a far more divided picture, with meaningful numbers of French Muslims, including plenty of women who themselves choose not to wear the hijab, expressing support for laïcité as a genuinely protective, universalist principle, alongside others who experience these same laws as a targeted, humiliating restriction on an ordinary act of personal faith. This is precisely why French politicians on the mainstream right and centre keep returning to this fight, rather than quietly letting it fade. Broad swaths of the electorate, including segments of the country's own Muslim population, continue to reward it at the ballot box, which is a detail that rarely makes it into international coverage that tends to frame this exclusively as a native French majority imposing restrictions on a uniformly opposed minority. So, where does that leave the honest observer, the person trying to understand this fight, rather than simply pick a side and repeat talking points at each other? France is not wrong that it has a coherent, internally consistent philosophical tradition here, one that predates the current controversy by more than a century, one that has already been tested and partially upheld by Europe's highest human rights court, and one that reflects a genuine, long-standing French anxiety, sharpened brutally by a real wave of Islamist terrorism in the last decade, about how much organized, visible religious identity a secular republic can absorb before it stops being secular at all. The argument that a headscarf, an abaya, a bikini, is never simply a personal fashion choice, but can also function as a visible marker of a broader political and religious project, one that French officials openly and explicitly call political Islam, is not a fringe conspiracy theory invented by the French far right. It is the stated, on-the-record position of senators, government ministers, ranking cabinet officials, and it has been for the better part of 2 decades, under governments of the left and the right alike. At the same time, the critics are not wrong either that these laws, in practice, land overwhelmingly on one specific religious minority, that they have repeatedly been found by international bodies to sit uneasily with basic religious freedom protections, and that a country's own commissioned research keeps failing to find the structural radicalization problem that keeps getting cited as the justification for tightening the rules further. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the fight is nowhere close to over. A verdict from the European Court of Human Rights is still pending. The sports ban itself is still working its way through the French legislative process, and somewhere underneath all of the legal language, all of the parliamentary procedure, all of the carefully worded ministerial statements, an actual French teenager, an actual competitive athlete, an actual mother walking her daughter to school, is the person who has to live inside whatever answer this fight eventually produces, long after the politicians who fought it have moved on to the next controversy. Whatever you personally believe about laïcité, about the hijab, about where the line between religious freedom and Republican unity should actually sit, the one thing you cannot honestly say, after everything laid out here, is that this fight is simple, that it is only about fabric, or that either side is arguing purely in bad faith.